You're still afraid, not of anything specific necessarily, not the way you were at 23, when the fear had edges and a name and showed up at predictable times. This fear is quieter, more ambient. It's the feeling you get before you make a phone call you've been putting off for 2 weeks, before you commit to something that requires you to be seen attempting it, before you say the thing that changes the room. It's the feeling that lives in the half second before every decision that actually matters. And what's remarkable, what I find genuinely fascinating, is that you have been living inside that feeling for decades now, and you have learned with extraordinary efficiency to call it something else. You call it being careful, being realistic, being responsible. You have rebranded fear so successfully that you no longer recognize it in yourself. Here's what I know about fear. After 40, it's not stronger. If anything, it's a thinner version of what it was at 20. The actual fear object, the failure, the humiliation, the judgment, you've already encountered most of the variants by now. You've survived the versions you were most afraid of. The thing that should have reduced the fear is that you now have evidence. Direct, personal, irrefutable evidence that you survived the things you were certain would undo you. You did not come undone. You are annoyingly still here, and yet the fear persists. Why? Because fear was never really about the threat. Fear was always about the story you told yourself about the threat. And stories don't die just because reality disproves them. They just get quieter, more polished, better disguised in the vocabulary of maturity and caution and wisdom. The mindset that kills fear after 40 doesn't require courage. It requires something much more specific. And I think you already know what it is. Let me trace this carefully, because the anatomy of fear after 40 is more precise than people acknowledge. And precision is the beginning of the solution. At 20, fear was mostly prospective. It lived in the future, what might happen, what you might lose, what they might think. You hadn't yet accumulated enough experience with outcomes to know how the feared thing would actually feel when it arrived. So fear had enormous operating room. It could fill the entire space between decision and consequence with speculation, span. And speculation is always worse than reality because reality has edges and speculation doesn't. Something changed around your late 30s. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the inventory started filling in. You experienced failure, not the abstract concept of failure, actual failure, with its specific, finite, survivable texture. You experienced humiliation that you thought would be catastrophic and turned out to be, in the long run, information. You experienced relationships ending, projects dying, bets not paying out, people not arriving, systems revealing themselves to be exactly as unreliable as a part of you that wasn't afraid, always suspected. You accumulated evidence. And here is the part I find most interesting. The evidence didn't reduce the fear the way it should have, because you never updated the underlying story. You had the experience, you survived the experience, and then you filed the experience in the memory without revising the prediction model. The prediction model, the one that says the feared outcome will be unmanageable, was never actually compared to the evidence. It was just maintained. You know what I've noticed? No. Let me put this differently. I knew a man who had survived an extraordinary amount of darkness by the time he was 40. Real darkness. Losses that would end in most people, and what I found genuinely extraordinary was that his fear of new losses was, if anything, larger after the accumulation than before it, because the story he'd built was not, I survived all of that, therefore I can survive more. The story was, each of those things cost me enormously, and the next one might be the one I don't come back from. He had converted every piece of evidence of his own resilience into evidence of his vulnerability. I thought that was one of the more creative things I'd ever seen a human mind do to itself. Here's what the internal dialogue actually sounds like at 40-something when fear arrives. You think, I know how this ends. You think, I've been here before and it didn't go the way I hoped, which is evidence that it won't go the way I hope now. You think, I'm not 23 anymore. I can't afford the kind of setback this might produce. You think, other people at my stage have made peace with their limitations, and maybe the reason they seem more at peace is because they stopped trying things that could fail. You think, the fear itself is trying to tell me something, and wisdom is listening to it. That last thought is the one that does the most damage. Because it reframes fear as intelligence. It makes the avoidance feel not like fear, but like discernment. The cage gets lined with velvet and called a choice. Here's what's actually happening. The fear is not measuring the real risk. It is measuring the story about the risk. And the story about the risk is decades old and has not been updated once since it was installed, despite the fact that you now have extensive evidence about your actual capacity to survive things, which the story completely ignores, because stories, unlike intelligence, are not interested in evidence that contradicts them. There's also the specific problem of what failure means at 40 compared to what it meant at 20. At T, when failure was temporary by definition, there was enough time ahead that even serious setbacks could be recovered from. And everyone around you understood that you were still in the experimental phase. At 40, failure feels more permanent. Not because it genuinely isn't, but because the cultural story about 40 has no experimental phase. The culture has decided you should know better by now. And the fear of being someone who should know better, but tried something and failed anyway, is a specific, expensive, largely invented form of shame. So here is the actual question. Not the soft version, if you already know, from direct evidence, that you survive the things you fear. What exactly are you protecting yourself from? 5 points, built like a demolition, delivered like an observation. Wisdom, that's the word. That's the word that fear has been hiding inside for the last decade of your life. Caution gets called wisdom. Avoidance gets called discernment. Hesitation gets called perspective. And the brilliant thing about this particular rebranding is that it makes fear sound like an achievement. Like you've earned the right to be afraid through the sheer accumulation of experience. As though the more you've seen, the more reason you have to stop moving, when any honest reading of experience says the opposite. Wisdom is accurate pattern recognition applied to current decisions. It uses the past as data. It says, here's what I've learned from what happened, and here's how that learning applies to this specific situation. It is forward-looking, specific, and calibrated to reality. Fear is not wisdom. Fear is an old prediction run on current data and producing the same output regardless of the input. It says, here is how this might go wrong, with the implicit assumption that how it might go wrong is more important than what evidence suggests about how it's likely to go. Wisdom and fear can look identical from the outside. Both can produce hesitation. Both can produce caution. But their internal mechanics are completely different. And the way to tell them apart is to ask, am I working from evidence or from a story about what evidence means? Real wisdom is the least afraid thing in the room. Fear wearing wisdom's outfit is the most afraid thing in the room, while being completely convinced it's the most rational. Fear after 40 has a very specific genealogy, and it didn't come from your experience. It came from the story you absorbed about what experience is supposed to produce. The dominant cultural narrative about aging says, implicitly but clearly, as you get older, the stakes get higher. The resources available to recover from failure get smaller. Then therefore the appropriate response to risk is increasing caution over time. This narrative is presented as natural, as the obvious conclusion of anyone who has lived long enough to understand how things work. It is, in fact, a specific story, told by specific interests, for specific reasons. The institutional preference for stability over disruption is served by a population that becomes more risk-averse with age. The financial industry benefits enormously from the idea that the older you are, the more you should protect what you have. The employment market benefits from workers who believe that their ability to recover from a failed bet diminishes with each year, because those workers are easier to retain and cheaper to manage. The social structures that depend on people staying in their lanes professionally, creatively, relationally, are served by fear being dressed as wisdom, because wisdom sounds like a choice and fear sounds like a problem. And people who are choosing are much more compliant than people who are afraid. Your fear is not a conclusion about your experience. It is a story about your experience that was delivered to you by systems that benefit from the story. There are people in your life who, when you express doubt or hesitation, immediately confirm it. They add to it. Yes, it is risky. Yes, at your age, the calculus is different. Yes, maybe wait a bit longer. Think it through a bit more. And they do this with the specific energy of people who are being helpful, who are on your side, who are offering the benefit of their own consideration of the risks involved. Examine that reflex. People who are genuinely fearless, and I mean this in the precise sense, not the performative sense, do not tend to confirm other people's fears. They tend to interrogate them. They ask, is this actually the risk you think it is? Or is this the story about the risk? They ask, what is the actual worst case? And what are the actual odds? They are interested in helping you make an accurate assessment. They are not interested in helping you feel validated in your avoidance. The people who confirm your fears are, almost always, confirming their own. Your expressed hesitation gives them permission to locate their own hesitation and call it collective wisdom rather than shared fear. You become the external evidence for the internal story they need maintained. And the most frustrating version of this is when the confirmation comes from people who love you because they are genuinely trying to protect you from the thing they themselves are afraid to do. I'll tell you something about fear and performance. I once knew someone who spent enormous time and energy looking fearless to exactly the audience who needed to believe it. Not actually fearless looking fearless. Very different. The performance was extraordinary. Completely convincing to everyone except the person delivering it. And the fear that performance was covering. Key. Fear of being found insufficient, of being seen as less than the role required, was, if anything, larger for being hidden. I found it instructive. Fear in performance costume is still fear. It's just more expensive to maintain. The people who need you to confirm your hesitation are not showing you wisdom. They are using your hesitation to authenticate their own. Here is what actually happens to fear after 40 when you stop feeding it with the story and start feeding it with accurate accounting. It shrinks, not dramatically, Not overnight. Not in a way that makes for an inspirational before and after. It shrinks the way water retreats from heat, slowly, steadily, across contact with the actual evidence of what you've survived. Because the fuel fear requires is uncertainty. It requires the gap between what might happen and what I know I can handle. And that gap narrows dramatically once you do the honest accounting of what you have already handled. You've survived failures that you were certain would be definitive. You've survived the end of relationships that you thought were structural to your survival. You've survived financial hits that seemed unsurvivable at the time and turned out to be temporarily terrible and eventually instructive. You've survived the judgment of people whose judgment you were certain would damage you, and it didn't, or it did, and you healed. You have, in 40-plus years of living, accumulated an extraordinary amount of direct evidence about your own capacity to survive things. The advantage of 40 is that the advantage of 40 is that the evidence exists. The disadvantage is that you haven't read it. The moment you actually read it, with the same rigor you apply to the stories about what might go wrong, fear loses the operating room it requires to function. It can still exist, but it can no longer pretend to be the most intelligent thing in the room. Fear that has been audited is fear that has been demoted. Point 5, distinguish frozen from calibrated. There are two kinds of people who appear fearless at 40. They look identical from the outside, but they operate completely differently from the inside. The first kind has convinced themselves that fear doesn't apply to them. They move fast, decide quickly, refuse to acknowledge risk with any seriousness. And because they're not processing fear, they're also not processing the real information that fear contains. Because fear, at its core, before it becomes a story, is a signal. It is the nervous system's flag that something is at stake. The person who has suppressed that signal entirely has also suppressed the flag. They move fast and they run into walls that a more calibrated person would have seen. They confuse absence of fear with intelligence. The second kind has done the accounting. They know what the signal means in their own specific nervous system, in their own specific history, in the specific context of this specific decision. They can read fear the way you read weather, not as a command to stop, but as information about conditions. They ask, is this signal pointing at a real risk or at an old story? They do the check, and then they decide. That's the mindset. That's the one. Not fearlessness. Fluency. The person who has developed fear fluency at 40 is not the person who stopped feeling it. It's the person who learned to translate it. 4 shifts. These change the operating architecture, not the surface behavior. The internal language of fear is very specific, and it does its most significant damage at the moment of decision. The half second before you commit or retreat, it sounds like, I'm not ready. I need more time. I should think about this more carefully. These phrases are architecturally identical to the phrases you would use if you were being genuinely cautious. They sound like intelligence. They feel like maturity. They are, almost always, fear in a clean jacket. Replace them. I'm not ready becomes, I have more information available right now than I have ever had at a decision point. What am I actually waiting for? I need more time becomes, I need to determine whether more time will produce more information or simply more opportunity for the story to reinstall itself. I should think about this more carefully becomes, I have been thinking about this. The question is whether the thinking is producing analysis or reinforcing avoidance. It's too risky becomes, what is the actual risk? Becomes, what is the actual risk? And how does it compare to the actual evidence of what I can handle? The goal of the replacement is not to eliminate caution. The goal is to force the fear to be specific. Vague fear has infinite power. Specific fear has a perimeter. Once it has a perimeter, you can work with it. Some of the environments you inhabit have a relationship to fear that you've been absorbing without noticing. The professional culture where risk is discussed only in terms of what could go wrong, never in terms of what could go right. The social circle where the dominant emotion around ambition is protective skepticism, where someone's enthusiastic commitment to something is met with a recitation of reasons it might not work. The media consumption that is calibrated toward worst-case scenarios because worst-case scenarios generate attention. The family environment where the language of safety and security has been the dominant emotional frequency for so long that any departure from it feels like ingratitude or recklessness. These environments are not making you smarter about fear. They are making fear louder. They are amplifying the story at the expense of the evidence. The audit is not about removing yourself from every environment that acknowledges risk. It is about identifying which environments treat fear as a conclusion versus which ones treat it as a data point. The first kind produces stasis. The second kind produces people who can actually move. Find more of the second kind. Spend more time there. Not to be told you can do it. To be in spaces where the question being asked is always what the evidence actually says rather than what the worst case might be. The next time fear presents itself, the next time the half-second pause arrives, the next time the quiet internal voice produces the not yet, the not sure, the maybe wait, you need 2 sentences. Internal for the architecture of your own response. The first, this is a signal, not a sentence. The second, I have survived everything I was most afraid of. This is not the exception, not bold, not triumphant. Certain, the certainty of someone who has actually done the accounting and found the results internally consistent. Who knows, from direct evidence rather than from hope, that the feared thing is manageable, because you have already managed it in one form or another, multiple times. This is not bravery. This is bookkeeping. The final shift is about the specific internal posture of someone who has made the decision that fear is no longer the final authority on their choices. This is not the same as deciding fear doesn't exist. It exists. It will continue to exist. It is a functional system built into you by evolution, and it has no interest in being eliminated. The ownership statement is not, I have eliminated my fear. The ownership statement is, fear is a member of the panel, not the chair. What this means in practice, fear gets heard. It gets asked what it's actually pointing at. Its signal gets translated and assessed. And then the decision is made by the full panel, which includes the evidence of what you've survived, the clarity about what you actually want, the assessment of what the actual, not imagined consequences of failure are. And fear's vote counts but does not determine the outcome. The person who has made this decision moves differently. Not faster, necessarily. Not more recklessly. More specifically. They are not trying to ignore the fear's signal. They are fluent in it. They know when it's pointing at something real and when it's maintaining a story. And the moment you can tell the difference, fear loses its veto power. This is the mindset. It doesn't arrive in a moment of inspiration. It is built slowly through the deliberate practice of asking the fear to be specific rather than simply obeying its general direction. You already have most of the material. You've been collecting it for 4 decades. The only remaining question is whether you're willing to actually read what you've accumulated. Here is what's actually happening at the level of the larger system. The culture of fear maintenance that you absorbed through institutions, through social norms, through the accumulated messaging of a world that runs better when its participants are risk-averse. That culture never updated its story about you. It built a model of you at 20 when fear was a reasonable tool for limiting costly experiments, and it has been running that model ever since. The model says, this person is afraid of failure, and that fear keeps them productive and compliant and inside the arrangement. And for a long time, the model was approximately accurate. But something happened. You accumulated evidence, real, direct, undeniable evidence, that the things you feared were survivable, that the failures were finite, that the judgments were temporary, that the worst outcomes were bad but not catastrophic. And most of the outcomes you feared didn't even happen. You became without the call. Luxure ever acknowledging it. Someone with a track record. Someone who has data. Someone who is, in the most literal sense of the phrase, no longer operating from theory. The culture's model of you is 20 years out of date. It is running a program that no longer corresponds to the actual person. And the gap between what the program predicts and what you've actually demonstrated about your own resilience is where fear goes to die, if you let it. Here is what is actually true about you right now. You are the most evidence-rich version of yourself that has ever existed. Every fear you've managed, every failure you've survived, every judgment you've weathered and continued, all of it is available to you as operating information, not as inspiration, not as encouragement, as data. Cold, accurate, empirical data about what you can handle. The person who reads that data clearly is not fearless. They are something better, calibrated. They know which signals are real and which are stories. They know, not from hope but from history, that the range of outcomes on the other side of a hard decision is finite and survivable. They move with the specific ease of someone who has done the math and found the results reasonable. That person is not a future version of you. That person is not a future version of you. They are the version you've been accumulating evidence to become for 40 years. The only variable remaining is whether you're willing to actually read the file. Fear doesn't die after 40 because you get braver. Fear dies after 40 because you finally have enough evidence to stop believing the story. The evidence has been in the file the entire time. Read it. Quiet, isn't it? Not peaceful, not calm, quiet. The way a room goes quiet after something falls and no one is sure whether to acknowledge it. That's where you are right now. That's where you've been for a while. And the interesting thing, the thing nobody talks about, because it's easier not to, is that the quiet didn't start on some random Tuesday. It started the exact moment you crossed 40, and the world stopped holding up its little signs to tell you what you were supposed to want next. You've been rebuilding. You just haven't had the vocabulary for it yet. You've been doing it at 3 a.m. when sleep won't cooperate. You've been doing it on commutes, in parking lots, in the middle of conversations where someone is telling you something you can no longer pretend matters. You've been doing it alone, which means you've been doing it right. You just haven't recognized it as power yet. You've mistaken it for failure, for stagnation, for the uncomfortable cousin of giving up. I find that amusing. Not because it's funny, because it reveals something about how thoroughly you've been trained. Trained to believe that transformation should be loud, that it should post progress photos, that it should come with a before and after and a moment where someone gasps at how far you've come. The monsters and fairy tales announce themselves. They roar. They descend on villages in ways that leave no room for misunderstanding. But the actual dangerous ones, the ones that reshape entire landscapes, those build in silence. Those move underground. Those don't need your applause to become what they're becoming. You've been underground, and the question isn't whether you'll surface. The question is what you'll look like when you do. Let me describe something to you. Tell me if it sounds familiar. You are somewhere between 40 and whatever number you've decided to quietly dread. And there is a gap. A precise clinical gap between who you were told you'd be by now and who you actually are when the room is empty and performance is off the table. You filled that gap with explanations. Good ones, actually. The economy, the timing, the relationship that cost you 3 years you hadn't planned to spend. The job that was supposed to be a stepping stone but turned out to be a very comfortable ceiling. You're not wrong about any of those things. What makes it interesting is that you use them as answers when they were always only part of the story. Here's the part you don't say out loud. You stopped. Not completely. Not dramatically. You didn't wake up one morning and announce a surrender. You just gradually, incrementally, across thousands of small decisions, stopped reaching for the version of yourself that made you uncomfortable. The ambitious version, the one that wanted things that seemed embarrassing to admit, you replace that version with something more reasonable. Something that wouldn't expose you to the specific agony of trying and still not arriving. You called it maturity. It was closer to anesthesia, and I want to be precise here, because this matters. And I want to be precise here because this matters. There's a difference between the exhaustion of someone who has genuinely run hard and needs to rest, and the numbness of someone who stopped running because the distance started to feel humiliating. You've been telling yourself you're resting, but you know when the room is empty which one this actually is. The internal monologue sounds something like this. You narrate it in the second person because it's easier that way. Easier to observe it than to claim it. You think it's too late. Not dramatically too late, not in a way that invites sympathy, just practically too late. The math doesn't work anymore. Starting over at this point means competing with people 15 years younger who have 15 years more hunger than you, and none of the accumulated weight of everything you've already survived. You think the people who reinvented themselves successfully are the exception, not the rule. You think I'm not special enough for the exception. You think the time I would have needed to become what I wanted, I spent becoming what was needed. And now the window is, you pause here, because you're not a dramatic person. Smaller. The window is smaller. That voice is meticulous. I'll give it that. It accounts for everything except one thing. It never accounts for what the silence actually built while you were busy deciding it was building nothing. It never accounts for the fact that someone who has absorbed 40 plus years of friction, failure, recalibration, and continued functioning has a particular kind of structural integrity that no 28-year-old with hunger and momentum and the beautiful idiocy of inexperience can replicate. You've been forged. You've just been calling it damage. I know someone new, actually. Very disciplined man. Very attached to his system, his very rigid, extremely consistent system. He was so committed to the structure he built around himself that he confused the structure with the person inside it. He spent years maintaining the architecture and forgot entirely about the inhabitant, what other people called strength. I recognized as a man who had become deeply afraid of what might happen if the walls came down. He found that thought intolerable. I found it clarifying. You're not him, but you've been doing a version of the same thing. You've been maintaining the structure of a life that may no longer fit the person who lives in it, and calling the maintenance virtue. So here's the question. Not a soft question. Not a therapeutic inquiry designed to help you feel safe exploring things. A real one. What are you actually protecting yourself from by deciding it's too late? Starting over. That's the phrase, isn't it? That's the one that makes the whole idea feel like a punishment. Starting over implies you lost something. Starting over implies you lost something. It implies the previous chapters were erased, the investments wasted, the miles walked in the wrong direction, counted against you in some ledger that someone, somewhere, is keeping. Starting over is the vocabulary of failure, and failure, as it has been sold to you, is something to avoid by never attempting anything where failure is possible. Here's what I want you to notice about that phrase. It requires you to believe that where you currently are has no value, that the accumulated mass of your experience, your scars, your refined understanding of what does not work and why, that all of that is a liability rather than the most expensive education on the market. You are not starting over. You are starting forward. You are starting forward from here with everything you actually have, which is considerably more than the 25-year-old who has the energy and none of the map. Maps matter more than people acknowledge. The ones drawn in blood and bad decisions are the most accurate. The word over is doing enormous damage. Replace it. You're not starting over. You are applying a different pressure to existing material. The belief that reinvention requires youth didn't come from evidence. It came from marketing. From a culture that confuses novelty with vitality and has very profitable reasons to make you believe that relevance has an expiration date, that your body is depreciating, that your ideas are calcifying, that the window for becoming something remarkable has the same shelf life as professional athleticism. Look at who benefits from you believing that. Look carefully. The answer is Eviv, Irion, who needs you compliant, predictable, too tired to ask inconvenient questions about why things are arranged the way they are. A person in the middle of reinvention is a genuinely destabilizing presence. They stop agreeing to arrangements that no longer serve them. They begin to withdraw the labor of their silence. They stop performing gratitude for things that were never gifts. The people and institutions that rely on your quiet participation in their vision of your life have a vested interest in you, believing that transformation is a young person's game. It never was. It was just easier to attempt when the cost of failure felt hypothetical. The cost is no longer hypothetical. That's not a disadvantage. That's precision. There are people in your life, you can see their faces, who have reacted to any signal of change in you with concern, with caution, with the specific, slightly patronizing variety of care that is really just discomfort wearing a compassionate expression. Isn't it a bit late for that? Are you sure that's realistic? I just don't want to see you get hurt. Examine those responses. Not with resentment, with curiosity, because people who are genuinely at peace with their own lives, people who've made their own choices from a position of integrity and satisfaction, do not feel threatened by someone else's reinvention. They don't need to pour cold water on it. They're interested. They're perhaps even a little inspired. They ask different questions. The cold water comes from people who have made a separate peace with their own quiet, who have decided, consciously or not, that the window is closed for them too, and who find your refusal to agree with that conclusion slightly inconvenient. Slightly accusatory, like you're proving something they'd prefer not to have proven. I had an acquaintance, remarkable dedication to a very specific image. Oh, F himself, this man, who couldn't abide watching other people shed theirs. Not because he was cruel, because every time someone he knew stepped out of the story they'd been assigned, it raised an uncomfortable question about whether his own assignment was chosen or merely accepted. He managed this discomfort by becoming very, very concerned for the people doing the stepping. I always found the care indistinguishable from the cage. The people questioning your reinvention are not seeing you clearly. They are seeing their own reflection in your decision and not liking what it shows them. Here's what 40-plus years of living actually produces, when you stop apologizing for it and start treating it as a resource. Pattern recognition. Not the kind you learn in a course. The kind that comes from having watched enough cycles of boom and collapse. Relationship dynamics. Organizational dysfunction, and your own internal sabotage that you can now see the shape of things before they fully arrive. You have a form of anticipatory intelligence that cannot be taught. It is earned one disappointment at a time, and it is extraordinarily rare in the people who most loudly occupy rooms. Selective investment. When you're young, you spend energy indiscriminately because you believe you have infinite reserves. You don't know yet what drains you. You spend enormous resources on things that will later reveal themselves as completely irrelevant. By now, you know which conversations are actually negotiations. You know which enthusiasm is genuine and which is performance. You know which opportunities are real and which are designed to keep you busy and slightly insufficient. That knowledge is an operating advantage that compounds tolerance for discomfort. The generation of people currently celebrated for boldness has very little history of sustained hardship. You have been uncomfortable, artrable, repeatedly, across decades, and you have continued. That endurance is not visible in the way that youth and novelty are visible, but it is structural. It is in the bones of how you operate. And it is precisely what long-form reinvention requires. The quiet ones who rebuild after 40 are dangerous in the best possible way. Not because they move fast, because they move with conviction. There is a version of this that goes badly. I should name it, and I should name it, because honesty matters more than comfort, and I have never had much patience for conclusions that require the omission of relevant data. The version that goes badly is the reinvention that is really just an escape. The career pivot that is actually an avoidance of the relationship that needs addressing. The fitness transformation that is really a displacement activity for the creative work you're terrified to attempt. The spiritual journey that conveniently keeps you too busy to make any concrete decisions about anything. These are not reinventions. They are renovations of the same suppression in a more flattering aesthetic. The version that works is the one where you know the difference between what you're moving toward and what you're moving away from. And you can say, without flinching, which one this actually is. The version that works involves the same silence, but a different quality of silence. Not the silence of someone hiding. The silence of someone building. Of someone who has decided that the noise was costing too much, and that the work requires the kind of focus that the noise always delayed. A knife in panic slices anything. A knife held with intent finds exactly what it's looking for. You've been in panic long enough. The question is whether you're ready to hold still. 4 shifts, not steps. Steps imply a staircase, a destination, a polite progression. These are posture shifts, changes in how you stand. The inside your own experience, they don't take long to understand. They take everything to actually do. The words you use internally are not neutral. They are architectural. They determine the shape of the space you're allowed to occupy in your own mind. And certain words have been doing slow, consistent damage for longer than you've been tracking. Too late becomes operating with precision I didn't have before. Starting over becomes applying pressure to existing material from a new angle. Wasted years becomes the cost of the education I actually received. I should have done this sooner becomes I am doing this now, which is the only moment that has ever been available to me. This is not positive thinking. Positive thinking requires you to ignore reality. This is accurate thinking. It requires you to expand the frame until reality is fully represented, including the parts of your history that are genuinely useful rather than just painful. The language shift is not about feeling better. It's about removing the words that were always just obstacles, wearing the costume of honesty. Some rooms were designed by people who had a specific version of you in mind. And that specific version was not particularly powerful, not particularly autonomous, not particularly invested in becoming something outside the parameters they'd envisioned. Those rooms may be professional. They may be relational. They may be the recurring Tuesday dinner where you leave slightly smaller than you arrived and tell yourself that's just how family works. You need to know which rooms those are, not to abandon them dramatically. Drama is expensive and usually counterproductive, but to know clearly and without self-deception that those environments were built to a specification that excludes who you're becoming, and that the rebuild will require spending more time in rooms, literal or metaphorical, where who you're becoming is not only possible, but expected. This is not about cutting people off. It is about understanding that you cannot do significant internal reconstruction while spending the majority of your time in the company of people for whom your transformation is a problem. Environments are not neutral. They are always either composting what you're trying to build or feeding. They are always either composting what you're trying to build. Choose accordingly, without announcement, without apology. The next time someone questions your reinvention, the next time you get the concern, the caution, the carefully calibrated doubt, dressed up as care, you will need 2 internal sentences. Not to say out loud, to say to yourself before you respond. The first, this is about them. The second, I don't need this to make sense to anyone who hasn't lived my particular life. That's it. Those 2 sentences. They don't require you to be aggressive. They don't require you to be aggressive. They don't require you to explain or justify or provide evidence that your direction is sound. They simply reset the terms of the exchange from I need their approval to I have my own information and it's sufficient. And then you respond warmly, briefly, without the hunger to convert them, and you return to the work. The work doesn't stop for the conversation. The work is never needed an audience. There is a particular posture, you've seen it in people, rarely, but you've seen it, where someone is completely unconcerned with whether their direction is validated, not arrogant, not performing indifference. Actually, genuinely, structurally uninterested in whether the people around them understand what they're doing or have decided it's a good idea. That posture is available to you. It is not a personality trait. It is a decision. It is specifically the decision to stop making your continuity contingent on consensus. The quiet rebuild doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't require a narrative that holds together for an outside observer. It requires only this, that you know why you're doing it, that the why is genuinely yours, and that you are willing to show up for it on the days when no external evidence confirms that anything is working. The rebuild is already happening. It started the moment you stopped pretending the current arrangement was good enough. The only question is whether you'll own it, deliberately, irrevocably, without the usual caveat about how things might not work out. Things might not work out. They never came with a guarantee. The difference now is that you're old enough to know that the failure you're afraid of and the failure of not trying are non-equivalent risks. One of them is at least interesting. Make the interesting choice. Here is the larger pattern, the one underneath everything I've said. The systems you were handed, the career timelines, the social expectations, the informal rules about who gets to reinvent and at what stage of life that becomes acceptable. Those systems were not designed with your particular interior life in mind. They were designed for legibility, for manageability, for the convenience of institutions that function better when the people inside them are at a predictable stage of a predictable arc. The idea that transformation has a deadline is not a biological reality. It is an administrative preference that has been successfully marketed as wisdom. You were never the problem. You were a person with a specific, complicated, non-standard interior trying to fit themselves into a standard issue container, and the friction you felt was the friction of the mismatch, not the friction of your own failure. What is actually true about you right now in this moment? You have survived enough that the things that used to stop you no longer have the same. That used to stop you no longer have the same. Mass, you have lost enough that you know concretely and without abstraction what actually matters. You have failed in enough specific ways that your remaining attempts carry none of the naivety that makes early failure so expensive. You are operating with a kind of compressed, pressurized clarity that only comes from having spent considerable time in environments that did not fit. That is not a consolation prize. That is the actual prize. You just had to wait until now to be able to use it. The reinvention that happens after 40 in silence without the applause of youth and the safety net of an experience, that is the one that tends to hold. Not because quiet people are more virtuous, because they have fewer illusions left to lose. Because they have fewer illusions left to lose. Because they've already done the part where you discovered that most of what you were chasing was a story someone else told about what your life should look like. And they've already survived the grief of that discovery. The monster in the fairy tale roars because it needs to be known. Because being known is its power. But the thing that actually changes landscapes doesn't roar. It moves quietly under the surface, redirecting rivers, shifting the weight of mountains by fractions of degrees across decades, until one morning the terrain is simply different, and no one can say precisely when the change began. That's you. That has always been you. The question was never whether you had the capacity. The question was whether you'd stop apologizing for the peculiar, inconvenient shape of it long enough to let it work. It works. It works. The silence was never your weakness. It was the thing you were building in. You're already doing it. Right now, whatever you told yourself this morning, the version of you that was going to be different, was going to start, was going to finally, that version quietly folded sometime around 10 minutes after you woke up. And you know what's interesting about that? You didn't even notice the exact moment it happened. Most people, and I use that word generously, most people confuse discipline with punishment. They think it's something applied to them. Like a sentence, like something a stricter version of themselves would impose if they ever got around to being that person. They wait for motivation the way you wait for weather, patiently, passively, with an umbrella they never actually carry. And that's the part I find genuinely fascinating. Not the failure. Failure is ordinary. What's fascinating is the story. A story people tell themselves about why the effort is happening somewhere else, in someone else's life, for someone else's reasons. A story that says the people who actually do the work, in the dark, before anyone applauds, before anyone notices, before there is any evidence it's working, that those people must have something you don't, some ingredient, some advantage you weren't born with. Let me tell you about the dark. The dark is not a metaphor. The dark is 5 a.m. when nobody's watching. The dark is the third week of a habit when the novelty is dead and the results haven't arrived yet. The dark is the part of the training montage they cut out of the film because it looks exactly like someone sitting alone doing something repetitive with no audience and no reward. That's the part they cut. That's the part that builds everything. Monsters don't train where you can see them. They train precisely because you can't. You know what the real problem is. Not laziness, not weakness. Those are convenient words. Comfortable diagnoses that let you skip the actual autopsy. The real problem is that at some point, very early on, you learned that effort without an audience doesn't count. Not formally. Nobody sat you down and said those words, but you were praised when people saw you try. You were rewarded for the performance of working, not for the work itself. Gold stars appeared when teachers were watching. Parents clapped when you did something in front of them. And somewhere in the soft, impressionable archetypal mind, a rule got written. If no one can see it, it doesn't matter. So you grew up performing effort rather than producing it. You studied near the desk. You exercised near the gym. You committed to things and conversations and then quietly retired the commitment once the conversation ended and the validation evaporated. You're not lazy. You're audience dependent, which is, if I'm being honest, considerably more tragic. Because laziness at least has the dignity of consistency. And here is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, because I want you to hear the voice in your own head. The one that says things like, I'll start Monday. Not because Monday is strategically better. Not because some condition will be different by Monday. But because Monday is far enough away to feel like a real start and close enough to feel like you're still being responsible about it. It's a beautiful lie. Elegant, even. The kind of lie that feels like planning. Or this one. I need to feel ready. Ready. As if readiness is a state that arrives uninvited. Like a guest. And you just need to keep the house in order until it knocks. Ready never knocks. Ready is built in the dark, in the work, before the results make sense, and the people who understand that are not genetically superior to you. They simply stop waiting for the feeling before. Doing the thing? Let me tell you what the invisible work actually looks like from where I'm standing. It looks like someone who wakes up in the quiet and moves before their brain has time to negotiate. It looks like someone 3 weeks into something with no visible progress who continues anyway. Not because they're certain, but because they have decided that certainty is a luxury they have stopped requiring. It looks like someone who reads the chapter, runs the mile, writes the sentence, makes the call, with no audience, no applause, no external confirmation that any of it is adding up to anything. And they do this not once, not as a performance of discipline for a journal entry, but on a Tuesday that looks exactly like every other Tuesday with no occasion to justify it. That's what the monster looks like up close. Impressive, repetitive, consistent in the way that water is consistent, which is to say, in a way that moves things very slowly until the moment it doesn't, and then you can't stop it at all. Now, there's a particular species of person who watches someone like that and says, I could do that if I wanted to. They say it with the specific confidence of someone who has never actually tested the claim. You know the type, very invested in their own potential, very reluctant to convert it into anything verifiable. Their favorite sentence is, I've been thinking about a sentence that has no natural ending, because the thinking, you see, is the product. The thinking is the work. In their version of events, I once had the distinct pleasure of watching someone I knew, very disciplined man actually, in his own way, very devoted to a code, who spent an enormous amount of energy performing the idea of preparedness, always sharpening, always positioning, and somehow always waiting for the right moment to actually commit to the vulnerable part. The uncertain part. The part where you act before you know how it ends. He called it strategy. I called it the most elaborate fear response I'd ever seen wrapped in tactical vocabulary. The question underneath all of this, the one you've been not asking, is this. What have you built in the rooms where nobody was watching? They call it laziness. They call it inconsistency. They call it a lack of willpower, which is their favorite word because it implies that discipline is a resource. Some people simply have more of, like, height or luck or good bone structure. And if it's a resource you're born with, well, nothing to be done about it, is there? Willpower is not a resource. It is not a tank that some people fill at a special pump you never found. Willpower. That word they've given you to explain why you stop is just a name for what happens when someone's why is stronger than the friction of the moment. That's all it is. When the reason is loud enough, the obstacle is quieter. When the reason is faint, when it's some borrowed goal, some half-absorbed expectation from someone else's life, the friction wins, and they call that willpower failure, and you believe them. The people who work in the dark don't have more willpower. They have a different relationship with discomfort. They have stopped classifying the difficulty as evidence that something is wrong. They have learned the hard way, the only way that sticks, that the discomfort is not the obstacle. The discomfort is the process. And you cannot shortcut the process. You can only decide whether you're going to be inside it or outside it, watching and cataloging your reasons for staying where you are. Discipline is not a virtue. It is a conclusion. Here is where this behavior actually comes from. And I'm not interested in comforting you with the explanation, so don't mistake the clarity for kindness. It comes from a world that T was designed to reward visibility. Every system you grew up inside, education, employment, social performance, runs on the logic of observed output. You are assessed on what can be seen, which means the things you do in private, in silence, without proof or documentation or an audience, gradually feel less real, less valid, less worth doing. This is not a character flaw. It is a learned response to a genuinely broken incentive structure. The problem is that the invisible work, the work that nobody sees that you do in the quiet before the world, asks for a report, is precisely the work that compounds. It is the only work that compounds in the way that actually matters, and you've been subtly trained to deprioritize it because the system never built a mechanism to reward it in the moment. The dark is where real architecture gets laid. Everything the world eventually sees was built somewhere. Nobody was looking. Every skill that looks effortless was effortful in private for a long time, before it looked like anything at all. The invisible hours are not the prelude to the work. They are the work. The world rewards what it can see. The self is built by what it cannot. Let's talk about the people who call you inconsistent, who reference your last abandoned project, who catalog your previous starts and wave them at you as evidence of something permanent about your character. What does that tell you about them? A person who is genuinely content with their own output does not need to inventory yours. A person doing their own invisible work doesn't have the time or the interest to maintain a spreadsheet of your failures. The people loudest about your inconsistency are, nearly always, people who have made their peace with not trying and who require your failure to remain nearby reliably so the peace stays intact. Your improvement is, to them, a particular kind of disrepute. And there is another type, the one who phrases the judgment as concern, who says they're worried about you in a way that always seems to coincide with a moment you're actually making progress, changing something, shedding something, moving in a direction that makes the old version of the dynamic convenient. Watch for that one. That's the more sophisticated pressure, the kind delivered softly. I know a man, tremendously principled man, deeply committed to his own personal code, who was absolutely certain he was protecting people when he refused to let anyone see the parts of him that weren't in control. He'd appear when things were already going wrong, apply exactly enough effort to feel useful, and then retreat back behind the version of himself he decided was acceptable. Very consistent in that regard. Consistently performing readiness while guarding against the kind of actual vulnerability that might have made him more useful. He called it discipline. I thought it was something else. The people who judge your effort have made a quiet arrangement with their own stillness. Here is what the invisible work actually produces. Not philosophically, not poetically, concretely. Concretely. It produces self-knowledge that cannot be faked and cannot be purchased. When you have done something in the dark, with no audience, with no one to validate the effort, you know you've done it. This sounds simple. It is not. Most people spend their entire lives uncertain about what they are actually capable of because they have only ever been tested in front of other people, where the performance instinct kicks in and distorts the data. They don't know if they're capable They know if they're capable of appearing capable, which is a very different thing. The person who trains in the dark knows. Not perfectly, not without doubt, but with a kind of internal evidence that doesn't require anyone else to corroborate it. That accumulation, that private record of showing up when nobody was watching, becomes a form of confidence that no external validation can give you and no criticism can simply remove. It has a different texture than the confidence that comes from applause. It's quieter, it's sturdier, and it compounds in a direction that surprises people. The visible results appear after the invisible hours have stacked high enough, after the reps in the dark have added up past some threshold, and the people around you see a transformation that looks sudden. They see the sharpness, the capability, the result. They missed the years of quiet preparation. They will call it talent or luck or timing, and you will let them. The invisible work is the only work that produces something you can trust. There is a version of all of this that goes wrong. I'd be doing you a disservice not to name it. Discipline misused looks like rigidity dressed up as virtue. It looks like someone who equates suffering with progress, who, if they're not in pain, suspects they're not doing enough, and who eventually punishes rest, joy, and recovery because those things feel like the enemy. That version of discipline is fear wearing a very convincing costume. It is a compulsion calling itself commitment. That is not what I'm describing. Discipline owned, truly owned, the way a craftsman owns a tool, knows the difference between working in the dark because the work requires it, and hiding in the dark because the light is frightening. One is strategy. One is avoidance. Both can look identical from the outside on any given Tuesday. Only you know which one it is from the inside. The question of ownership is not, how much am I doing? The question is, am I doing this from a place of direction or from a place of dread? One of those grows you, one of those grinds you, and the grit. Nunning, the one that looks like discipline but isn't always ends the same way, with exhaustion that doesn't understand itself. A knife used in panic is still just panic, A knife held with intent is a different instrument entirely. Stop using the word motivation. Remove it from your internal vocabulary. Not because it's a bad concept, but because every time you invoke it, you are telling yourself that action is conditional on a feeling. And feelings are spectacularly unreliable scheduling systems. Replace it with appointment. You don't wait to feel like keeping appointments. You keep them because they are on the calendar, and the calendar does not care about your mood. When you treat your discipline as an appointment with yourself, with your future, with the version of you that exists on the other side of the work, but the version of you that exists on the other side of the work, the emotional weather becomes irrelevant. The appointment doesn't get canceled because you're tired. The appointment doesn't get rescheduled because you're tired. You show up the way you would show up for anything that mattered because you have decided in advance that it matters. And that decision doesn't require re-ratification every morning. Also, stop calling the gap between who you are and who you are becoming a failure. It is not a failure. It is a distance. Failure implies something went wrong. Distance implies there is a space to travel. You are not broken. You are not yet where you are going. That is a profoundly different sentence, and the internal experience of living inside it is profoundly. The language you use inside your own mind is not decoration. It is architecture. Build accordingly. Sit with this question and do not rush away from the discomfort of the answer. Which environments in your life were specifically constructed, however, unintentionally, to make your effort feel wrong. Which room tells you that working on, yourself is self-indulgent? Which relationship treats your ambition as a subject of mild humor? Which conversation always ends with you slightly less certain than when it started, not because the logic was challenged, not because the logic was challenged, but because the energy in the room didn't have space for what you were reaching toward? These environments are not neutral. They are not simply contexts. They are active forces. You can be the most internally committed person in the world and still find that the wrong room drains you in ways that are difficult to trace and easy to misattribute. You start to think the problem is you. It is not always you. You don't necessarily have to leave the room. Sometimes you can't, but you need to stop walking into it without knowing what it cost you, and you need to stop treating the cost as something other than what it is. Name the room. Name the relationship. Name the recurring conversation. And then decide with clear eyes what you're willing to spend there and what you're going to protect. The next time someone dismisses what you're building, subtly, snidely, or with the particular condescension of someone who has decided your efforts are quaint, here are the two sentences you say. Internally, you don't need to say them aloud. You don't need the audience. What they see is not what I know. I am not building for this moment. That's it? Not defensive? Not aggressive? Certain? The way a structure is certain? Not because it's trying to prove it's standing, but because it is. The security doesn't come from winning the argument or correcting the record. It comes from the private archive, from knowing what the dark hours contain, from the fact that the appointment was kept this morning, regardless of whether this conversation ever happened. Let them see what they see. You know what you're building. This is the mental posture you are moving toward, not as a goal to achieve, but as a ground to occupy. Not someday, beginning now, imperfectly, in whatever proximity to it you can manage today. The ownership statement is not pride. Pride performs. It looks sideways to confirm itself. This is something quieter than pride. It is the simple, immovable recognition that the work is yours. The effort is yours. The effort is yours. The accumulation is yours. The direction is yours. The direction is yours. And that this ownership does not require defense or explanation or anyone else's acknowledgement to remain true. You are not waiting for permission to be serious about this. You are not waiting for the result to justify the effort. You are not building in the hope that someone will eventually notice and confirm that you were right to. You are building because you have decided to build, full stop. That decision does not live in your mood. It does not live in your motivation. It does not depend on what Tuesday feels like, or whether anyone is watching, or whether the progress is visible yet. It lives in the quiet, repeated act of showing up in the dark, before the light comes, before the applause, before the proof. The monster does not train because training is pleasant. The monster trains because the monster has decided who it is, and that decision gets renewed every morning in a room where nobody is watching. Here's the larger pattern. The one noble. D wants to say out loud because it implicates everything. The world you were handed, the whole scaffolding of education, social media, performance culture, the entire architecture of modern ambition was built on the logic of visibility. If it can be seen, it counts. If it can be measured, it can be seen. It counts. If it can be posted, it's real. And anything that happens in the quiet, in the dark, in the private hours, in the space between who you are and who you are becoming, that falls through the floor. That doesn't exist in the ledger. This is the deepest trick that's been played on you. Not by any individual, not with malicious intent, just by the gradual cumulative weight of a system that required your performance more than it required your development. And the result is a generation of people who are fluent in the language of ambition, but terrified of the actual silence where the work gets done. Who know exactly how to talk about changing and have deeply ambiguous relationships with actually doing it. You are not immune to this. Neither am I, though, for different reasons. And I find mine considerably more interesting. But here is what is actually true about you right now, in this moment, underneath whatever story you've been running. You already know what the work looks like. You've always known. You know what you would be doing if you weren't waiting for the feeling. You know the room you'd walk into, the habit you'd resume. The thing you've been circling for months with an increasingly sophisticated series of reasons why right now isn't exactly the time. You know, you've known for a while. The only question that remains is whether the version of you that knows is going to show up tomorrow, not Monday. Monday, not when you feel ready, not when conditions are more favorable, but tomorrow in the dark, before the world has any opinion about it. No one gives you a monster bow. Dear guy, in the first day, no one gives you a monster mind in a single breakthrough. It is built in the accumulation, in the appointments kept without witnesses, in the miles run in the cold before anyone was awake to count them, in the pages written and the reps completed, and the decisions made in the silence that the world never gets to see and never gets to take credit for. The dark is not where you go when you fail. The dark is where you go when you're serious. Go train.